In a towering corporate empire, powerful yet lonely Mrs. Lillian commands respect and fear in equal measure. But little does she know, her greatest ally lies hidden in the quietest corners of her own building. When Tom, a humble janitor, uncovers a sinister plot that could bring her legacy crashing down, he's thrust into a world of deception and high stakes. And as unlikely bonds form, both will discover that loyalty and betrayal often come from the most unexpected places. Mrs. Lillian West had long ago grown accustomed to her solitude. As a widow and the CEO of one of the city's largest corporations, she spent most of her time alone. Her mansion, expansive and beautiful yet hauntingly silent, stood as a testament to her success and her loneliness. Every morning, she would leave its empty rooms, heading to her office with the sharp precision that had become her trademark. At the office, she was known as a disciplined and meticulous leader. Her presence commanded respect, yet few dared to approach her beyond what was necessary. Her gaze often wandered the bustling floors of her company, noting every detail, every movement of her employees. She could tell at a glance if a department was lagging behind or if someone was slacking off. Yet, despite her keen eye and attention to detail, Mrs. Lillian remained distant from her team. She rarely allowed herself to engage personally with anyone, convinced that personal bonds could weaken her authority and cloud her judgment. One of the people who blended seamlessly into the background was Tom Harris. Tom had worked as a janitor at the company for nearly a decade, quietly moving through the hallways in the early mornings and late evenings. Tall, with graying hair and gentle eyes, Tom carried a quiet humility that made him nearly invisible to those around him. He knew every corner of the building, every creak in the floorboards, and every squeaky door hinge. His work was diligent but unremarkable, his presence acknowledged only by a few polite nods here and there. Despite his unassuming role, Tom was a sharp observer. His years of sweeping floors and tidying offices had given him a unique insight into the rhythm of the company and the character of the people within it. He saw what others often missed: the stress lines on a manager's face, the subtle exhaustion in a junior employee's posture. Yet Tom never sought attention or recognition. His role was clear, and he performed it with a quiet pride. Then, one chilly autumn morning, something strange happened. As Mrs. Lillian was leaving her office after an intense meeting, she paused by the janitorial closet where Tom was sorting supplies. She regarded him thoughtfully for a moment, her piercing gaze lingering on him in a way that made him straighten his posture, unsure of what to expect. "Tom," she began, her voice calm but commanding. "I need you to accompany me to a meeting this afternoon." Tom blinked, certain he had misheard her. She wanted him to attend a meeting? His initial reaction was a mix of confusion and reluctance. Surely there had been some mistake. He was just a janitor, a quiet, unremarkable worker. Why would she want him in an important meeting? "Ma'am, I don't know if I'm the right person for that," he said hesitantly, his voice barely above a whisper. She observed him with an inscrutable expression, a slight smile curving her lips. "You're the right person, Tom," she assured him, her tone leaving no room for argument. "I trust you. That's enough." With a nod, she turned and walked away, leaving him alone in the hallway with a storm of thoughts and emotions. Why would she trust him? What could she possibly see in him that others hadn't? As the day wore on, Tom felt the weight of Mrs. Lillian's words pressing on him. He was nervous but strangely touched. No one had ever shown him that level of trust, much less someone like Mrs. Lillian. He decided he would attend the meeting, despite his reservations, determined not to let her down. By the time he made his way to the boardroom that afternoon, his hands felt clammy, and his heart was racing. Yet, as he took his seat at the table, he reminded himself of Mrs. Lillian's words, "I trust you." For reasons he couldn't fully understand, that simple statement filled him with a quiet confidence. The boardroom was quiet when Tom entered, an imposing space with high ceilings, polished wood, and leather chairs that exuded a sense of power and authority. He felt out of place, standing awkwardly near the entrance. This room had always been a distant part of his world. one he had only glimpsed from the outside, never imagining he'd have a seat at its table. Across the room, Mrs. Lillian sat at the head of the table, her expression calm, hands folded before her. Her presence was unwavering, exuding a confidence that seemed to fill every corner of the room. Tom couldn't help but marvel at her. She seemed completely unfazed, as if her mind was 3 steps ahead of everyone else in the room. As Tom hesitated near the door, Mrs. Lillian looked up and gestured for him to sit beside her. He moved quickly, conscious of his shuffling footsteps and feeling an odd mix of pride and anxiety. As he took his seat, the boardroom door opened again, and a man strode in. Tom recognized him from whispers in the corridors and brief glimpses at company events. This was Mr. Blackstone, a prospective partner with a reputation that made even seasoned executives wary. Mr. Blackstone was a tall, well-dressed man with an air of confidence that bordered on arrogance. His dark eyes scanned the room, lingering on Tom briefly before he turned his attention fully to Mrs. Lillian. He offered her a charming but insincere smile as he set his briefcase on the table, seemingly unaware of Tom's presence. "Mrs. West," he greeted her with a smooth voice, extending his hand. "It's a pleasure, as always." "Mr. Blackstone," Mrs. Lillian replied, her tone polite but distant. She shook his hand briefly, then gestured for him to take a seat opposite her. Tom watched, feeling the tension in the air and trying to make himself as inconspicuous as possible. As they began discussing the potential deal, Mr. Blackstone launched into a well-rehearsed pitch, detailing the benefits of the proposed partnership. He spoke eloquently, every word seemingly tailored to impress. His demeanor was polished, but Tom noticed something else. A barely perceptible impatience in Blackstone's movements, a tension that seemed at odds with his smooth speech. Tom tried to focus, though much of the conversation drifted beyond his understanding. Yet, something gnawed at him, a feeling that something wasn't right. He could tell Mrs. Lillian was listening intently, her gaze unwavering as she watched Mr. Blackstone. But Tom felt a growing unease as he glanced around the room, his attention drawn to a briefcase on the floor beside Mr. Blackstone's chair. For a moment, Tom's eyes caught something unusual, a folder partially sticking out from beneath the briefcase. It looked like it had been deliberately tucked away, perhaps meant to be hidden. A wave of doubt surged through him. Could this be part of Blackstone's pitch? Or was it something he didn't want Mrs. Lillian to see? The longer he stared at the hidden document, the more his gut told him it was important. He looked back at Mrs. Lillian, who was still engaged in the conversation, seemingly unaware of what Tom had noticed. A battle raged within him. Should he interrupt the meeting? If he was wrong, he'd look foolish, and worse, he'd betray the trust Mrs. Lillian had shown him. But if he was right, the decision weighed heavily on him, and before he could second-guess himself, he cleared his throat. The slight sound was enough to halt the conversation. Mrs. Lillian turned her head towards him, her expression one of slight surprise. "Excuse me, ma'am," he began, his voice barely steady. I noticed a document near Mr. Blackstone's briefcase. I think it might be important." For a split second, silence filled the room. Then Mrs. Lillian's gaze shifted to Mr. Blackstone. Her calm expression had hardened, her eyes cold as she looked at him with new suspicion. "Is that so?" she asked, her tone sharp, her words laden with an unspoken challenge. Mr. Blackstone's face tightened, his charming smile slipping as he glanced down at his briefcase. He tried to laugh it off, but the room's atmosphere had shifted irreversibly. Mrs. Lillian held out her hand. "I'd like to see that document, Mr. Blackstone." There was no room for refusal, and Mr. Blackstone, his confidence visibly rattled, reluctantly pulled the document from beneath his briefcase and handed it over. Tom watched, his heart racing as Mrs. Lillian unfolded the document and began to read, her expression growing darker with each passing second. The unease that Tom had felt was now confirmed. This document contained clauses that, if signed, would effectively transfer a significant portion of the company's assets to Mr. Blackstone's control, under a cleverly disguised pretense of management fees. It was nothing short of an attempted takeover. Mrs. Lillian looked up, her gaze colder than he had ever seen it. "Mr. Blackstone, would you care to explain this?" The man stammered, his confidence shattered, as he tried to concoct an explanation. But Mrs. Lillian's resolve was ironclad. "I think we're done here," she said icily, dismissing him. "Thank you for your time." Tom sat in stunned silence, unable to believe what had just transpired. He had only come to this meeting because Mrs. Lillian had asked him to, yet his simple observation had averted a potential disaster. After Mr. Blackstone left, Mrs. Lillian turned to Tom. Her expression softened as she regarded him with an appreciation he hadn't expected. "Thank you, Tom," she said quietly, her voice filled with genuine gratitude. "You saved us from making a grave mistake today. I knew I could trust you." The words struck him deeply, resonating in a way he hadn't anticipated. He nodded, feeling an overwhelming sense of pride and responsibility. In that moment, he realized his role at the company, though humble, had greater value than he'd ever believed. Tom left the boardroom that day feeling like he was walking on clouds. Never in his wildest dreams had he imagined he would play such a crucial role in protecting the company, and especially not one of Mrs. Lillian's magnitude. For the next few days, he kept a low profile, going about his duties as usual, but he couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed. Each hallway he mopped, every desk he dusted, seemed to carry more significance now. Meanwhile, word spread quietly among the upper ranks about the near disaster with Mr. Blackstone. Employees whispered about Mrs. Lillian's close call and how she had narrowly avoided signing a contract that would have drained the company's resources. But no one seemed to know exactly what had happened, only that she had somehow managed to see through the scheme. Despite the whispers, Mrs. Lillian continued her daily routines, and so did Tom. He didn't expect to be acknowledged further. In his mind, his role had been a brief but vital moment, and he was content to return to the shadows of anonymity. But Mrs. Lillian had other ideas. One afternoon, she sent a message to Tom through her assistant, asking him to come to her office. Tom arrived at her door, nervously wiping his hands on his pants and feeling out of place. The assistant gestured him in, and he found Mrs. Lillian seated behind her large desk, her gaze piercing yet warm. "Tom," she began, gesturing to the chair in front of her desk. "Please have a seat." Tom hesitated for a moment before settling into the plush leather chair, feeling the weight of her attention on him. He hadn't been in her office before, and the grandeur of it. The tall bookshelves filled with volumes on finance and leadership, the tasteful paintings, the elegant decor, left him a bit awestruck. Mrs. Lillian observed him for a moment, then offered a rare smile. "I wanted to personally thank you again," she said. "What you did for the company. It was more than just alerting me to a suspicious document. You acted on intuition, on loyalty." Tom nodded, feeling his cheeks warm under her praise. "I only did what I thought was right, ma'am. I couldn't just sit there and watch if something felt wrong. And that's exactly why I value you," she replied, her gaze unwavering. "You might think of yourself as just a janitor, but loyalty and integrity are traits that can't be bought, Tom. They're rarer than any skill set or degree." She paused, letting her words sink in. "I'd like to offer you a chance to take on more responsibility within the company, if you're willing." Tom's eyes widened in surprise. "More responsibility?" he repeated, hardly believing his ears. "Yes," Mrs. Lillian continued, nodding. "You know this building and its people better than most. I'd like you to be part of a new team I'm forming. You'd be my eyes and ears around the company, an advisor, if you will." Tom felt a mixture of pride and disbelief. He had never imagined being anything more than a quiet, unseen worker in the company, yet here was Mrs. Lillian, offering him a position of trust and responsibility. I don't know what to say, ma'am," he stammered, struggling to find the right words. "But I'm honored, truly honored." Mrs. Lillian smiled again, her expression softening. "Then it's settled. From now on, you'll work directly with me on select projects. It won't change your title, but it will give you access to the insights and areas of the company that few others see. Does that sound agreeable? Tom nodded, barely able to contain his excitement. Yes, ma'am, I'll do my best. Mrs. Lillian gave him an approving nod. Good. And one more thing, Tom. This job is as much about trust as it is about observation. I'm counting on you to bring any concerns to me, no matter how small they may seem. Tom met her gaze, the weight of her trust settling over him with a gravity he hadn't anticipated. You have my word, Mrs. Lillian. With that, she dismissed him, and Tom left her office with a sense of purpose he had never felt before. The building seemed brighter somehow, the bustling employees more vibrant, as if the entire world had shifted. He wasn't just a janitor anymore. He was a trusted ally, someone Mrs. Lillian relied on. For the first time in a long time, Tom allowed himself to dream. In the days that followed, Tom found himself gradually stepping into his new role, though he did so quietly, maintaining the humble, unassuming manner he had always possessed. Mrs. Lillian hadn't changed his title, and he still cleaned and tidied the office spaces like before. But now, there was a purpose behind his actions that extended beyond simple custodial work. Each morning, as he went about his tasks, he observed the company's daily flow with heightened awareness. He noticed details that others missed: the tension on a manager's face as he hurried down the hall, the whispered conversations between employees, the patterns in their routines. Tom made mental notes of anything that felt out of place or concerning, ready to report back to Mrs. Lillian whenever necessary. One afternoon, he overheard a conversation between two junior employees in the break room. They were discussing a particular department's unusually high spending on a recent project. From what he gathered, there seemed to be confusion over budget approvals, and one of the employees hinted that a senior manager was behind the overages. Tom didn't fully understand the specifics, but he sensed that the matter might warrant Mrs. Lillian's attention. That evening, he jotted down the details he'd heard and tucked the note into his pocket, intending to bring it up in his next meeting with her. The following day, he arrived at Mrs. Lillian's office at her request. As he stepped inside, he felt a twinge of nervousness, but it was tempered by a growing sense of responsibility. Mrs. Lillian welcomed him with a nod, gesturing for him to sit. "Good afternoon, Tom," she greeted, her tone as composed as ever. "How are things?" "Good, ma'am," he replied, shifting slightly in his chair. "There's something I thought you should know about. I overheard a conversation yesterday. Two employees were discussing unusual spending in one of the departments. It sounded like there might be a manager involved, someone who's been pushing through expenses without clear approvals." Mrs. Lillian raised an eyebrow, a glint of interest flashing in her eyes. "Interesting. Which department was this?" "Marketing, I believe," Tom answered, recalling the details. They were talking about recent campaigns and something about budget discrepancies. Mrs. Lillian nodded thoughtfully, folding her hands on her desk. "Thank you, Tom. I'll look into this further. You did well to bring it to my attention." Tom felt a surge of pride at her words. It was strange to think that something as simple as overhearing a conversation in the break room could hold importance to someone like Mrs. Lillian. But he was learning that her trust in him was genuine, and that even his smallest observations could have a significant impact on the company. As the weeks went by, Tom became more comfortable in his role as Mrs. Lillian's eyes and ears. He grew accustomed to noticing details that others overlooked, and his sense of responsibility deepened with each new observation he brought to her. It was a quiet role, one that kept him largely in the background, but he was content with it. Then, one day, he noticed something peculiar. As he was cleaning the offices late in the evening, he spotted Mr. Blackstone lingering in the hallway outside one of the conference rooms. Tom watched from a distance, his instincts kicking in. Mr. Blackstone seemed to be studying the layout of the offices, his eyes scanning the space with a calculating look. Tom's unease grew as he observed Mr. Blackstone's movements. The man appeared to be searching for something, though Tom couldn't quite determine what. He decided to keep his distance, not wanting to draw attention to himself, but he made a mental note of the incident. if Mr. Blackstone was still hanging around the company, despite Mrs. Lillian's dismissal, there was a chance he had other plans in mind. The next morning, Tom reported his observation to Mrs. Lillian. She listened intently, her expression darkening as he described Mr. Blackstone's strange behavior. "This isn't the first time I've heard something like this," she murmured, a hint of concern in her voice. "He's been making subtle attempts to stay involved with our operations, even after our last encounter." Tom frowned, sensing the gravity of the situation. "Do you think he might try something?" Mrs. Lillian nodded slowly. "It's possible. Blackstone is not one to let go easily. I suspect he may be looking for vulnerabilities to exploit." She paused, glancing at Tom with a thoughtful expression. "You've proven to be quite observant, Tom. I may need your help with this matter more directly. Keep a close eye on anything unusual, and don't hesitate to inform me. I have a feeling Mr. Blackstone's schemes are far from over." Tom nodded, feeling a surge of determination. He knew that his role had grown beyond mere observation. Now, he was actively protecting the company from potential threats. As he left her office, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As Tom continued his duties, he felt the weight of Mrs. Lillian's words linger with him. Mr. Blackstone's continued presence was more than just unsettling. It hinted at a danger that ran deeper than he had initially realized. Now, every hallway, every shadow seemed like it could hold a hidden threat. Tom sharpened his senses, becoming more vigilant in his day-to-day activities. One evening, as he was finishing up his duties, Tom noticed a faint light emanating from the corner office on the 5th floor, a floor that was typically empty at this hour. His curiosity piqued. Tom approached the office quietly and peered inside. To his surprise, he saw a junior employee, Jack, rummaging through a cabinet near the back wall. Jack had only joined the company recently, and Tom had observed him a few times, always a bit nervous and uncertain. Tom watched as Jack pulled out a folder, flipping through its contents hastily. The way he moved, furtively, glancing over his shoulder every few seconds, suggested that he wasn't supposed to be there. Just as Tom was deciding whether to confront him, Jack closed the folder, shoved it into his bag, and slipped out of the office, brushing past Tom without noticing him. Unease settled over Tom as he considered what he had just witnessed. Why would a junior employee be going through confidential documents after hours? And what was so important in that folder that he felt the need to take it? Tom's gut told him that this wasn't just a coincidence. The following morning, Tom reported the incident to Mrs. Lillian. She listened attentively, her face unreadable as he described Jack's actions. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention, Tom," she said, her tone steady. "Jack has been on my radar recently. He was recommended by Mr. Blackstone himself, which, under normal circumstances, would not raise any alarms. But given what we know now, it seems this might be part of a larger plan." Tom's eyes widened. "You think Blackstone is using Jack to get information from inside the company?" Mrs. Lillian nodded thoughtfully. "It's a distinct possibility. Blackstone may have placed Jack here as a way to keep tabs on us or to gather sensitive information. But now that we're aware of his actions, we can take steps to protect ourselves." Her voice turned firmer. "I'll arrange for our IT team to monitor Jack's activity. In the meantime, continue to keep an eye on him, Tom. I trust your instincts." Tom felt a chill run down his spine. The stakes had never felt higher. What had started as a suspicion was now evolving into a full-blown conspiracy, and Tom was determined to protect the company from Blackstone's hidden agenda. In the following days, Tom observed Jack more closely, noting his interactions and any peculiar behavior. Jack appeared nervous, often glancing around as if he feared he was being watched. Tom couldn't help but feel a sense of urgency building. He knew he had to be vigilant. Blackstone's influence seemed to be creeping into every corner of the company. Then, one night, Tom noticed something unusual on the company's computer network while he was cleaning the IT office. Files were being transferred from one of the executive computers, and he quickly realized it was Mrs. Lillian's. The transfer was happening remotely, and Tom could only watch in horror as files zipped across the screen. Panicked, Tom immediately called Mrs. Lillian, who instructed him to shut down the main server. Working quickly, he followed her instructions, cutting the data transfer short before all the files could be extracted. The following day, an internal investigation revealed that Jack had attempted to breach the company's systems with outside help, intending to download proprietary data. Mrs. Lillian confronted Jack directly, and under pressure, he revealed that Blackstone had indeed hired him to gather information. Blackstone had promised him a promotion and a hefty bonus in return. Jack's confession was enough for Mrs. Lillian to take action. She fired him on the spot and had her legal team prepare to take action against Blackstone. Tom watched the scene unfold, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and relief. His vigilance had once again saved the company from potential disaster. That evening, as Mrs. Lillian and Tom reviewed the events, she looked at him with profound gratitude. "Tom," she said quietly, "without you, this company would have been vulnerable to Blackstone's schemes. I don't think you fully understand how valuable you are to us." Tom nodded, feeling both proud and humbled. He had grown into a role that went beyond anything he'd ever imagined. He wasn't just an observer anymore. He was a protector, a trusted ally in Mrs. Lillian's fight to keep her company secure. Mrs. Lillian's gaze softened. "I've been thinking, Tom. I'd like to offer you an official position within the company, a role that reflects the trust and responsibility you've earned. You may still prefer the quiet life, but know that if you're willing, there will always be a place for you here." Tom met her eyes, a newfound sense of purpose filling him. "Thank you, Mrs. Lillian. I'd be honored to continue to serve." And in that moment, Tom knew he had found his place, not only in the company but in a role that he had truly made his own. Despite Jack's confession and dismissal, Tom and Mrs. Lillian both knew that Blackstone wasn't one to back down easily. While Jack had been removed, Blackstone still held influence and resources outside the company, and his ambition was as relentless as ever. Mrs. Lillian prepared for legal action, but she warned Tom that Blackstone might attempt one final, desperate move. Days passed, and Tom resumed his duties with renewed purpose. He took extra precautions, double-checking every detail around the company. As he walked through the halls each evening, he felt an odd mixture of tension and pride. Every corner of the building seemed to hum with his newfound responsibility, and he remained on high alert, knowing that Blackstone might strike at any time. Then, one night, Tom noticed something unusual. As he was doing his rounds on the upper floors, he saw a shadowy figure slipping into one of the back offices. He quickly recognized the figure. It was Blackstone himself. Tom's heart raced. He knew he couldn't confront Blackstone alone, so he immediately called Mrs. Lillian, who answered in a calm, yet serious tone. She told him to stay put but remain unseen, as she was on her way with security personnel. From his hidden vantage point in the hallway, Tom watched as Blackstone rifled through the office, searching for something specific. His face was a mask of determination, his movements quick and methodical. Tom could tell that this was a man driven to the edge, willing to take whatever he could get his hands on, even if it meant trespassing. After what felt like an eternity, Mrs. Lillian arrived with 2 security guards. She motioned for Tom to stay back as they entered the office, catching Blackstone off guard. Startled, Blackstone froze, his hand halfway into a desk drawer. "Mr. Blackstone," Mrs. Lillian said, her voice cold and commanding, "I believe you're in the wrong place." Blackstone straightened, his face contorting with anger. "Lillian," he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "You've always had this company wrapped around your little finger, but you can't keep me out forever." Mrs. Lillian took a step forward, her gaze fierce and unyielding. "I built this company with integrity and hard work. You, on the other hand, have only ever tried to take shortcuts, exploiting those around you for your own gain." Blackstone scoffed. "And what has it gotten you? An empty house? A life spent alone?" His voice was taunting, as if trying to provoke her. But Mrs. Lillian didn't flinch. "I'd rather be alone than surrounded by those who betray and deceive," she replied icily. Now, if you have any dignity left, you'll leave on your own. Blackstone's face twisted in fury, but he knew he was outnumbered. He shot one last venomous glare at Mrs. Lillian before storming out of the office, flanked by the security guards who escorted him out of the building. Once he was gone, Mrs. Lillian turned to Tom, her expression softening. "Thank you, Tom. I don't know what would have happened tonight if you hadn't been here." Tom felt a wave of relief and pride. "I'm just glad I could help, ma'am," he replied, feeling the significance of the night settling over him. Mrs. Lillian gave him a grateful smile. "I think it's time to make some changes around here. Blackstone's influence ends tonight, and I'd like you to help ensure this company moves forward, stronger than ever." Tom nodded, feeling a sense of closure and purpose like never before. He had stepped out of the shadows and played a vital role in protecting the company he had always been loyal to. And as he walked through the building that night, he knew that he had truly found a place where he belonged. A place where he was no longer just a janitor, but a trusted friend and ally. In the months that followed, Tom officially took on a new role within the company, working closely with Mrs. Lillian to keep everything running smoothly. His title might have been modest, but his influence was unmistakable. He was Mrs. Lillian's trusted confidant, always keeping an eye on the company and ensuring that it stayed true to its values. As for Blackstone, he faced legal consequences for his actions, his schemes exposed and dismantled. Without a foothold in the company, he quickly faded from view, a lesson in the consequences of greed and betrayal. And Mrs. Lillian, though still reserved and private, began to show a softer side, sharing more moments of warmth and gratitude with her employees, especially Tom. They shared a quiet understanding, a bond forged in loyalty and trust. Tom's life was no longer confined to sweeping floors and emptying waste bins. He had become a guardian of the company, a silent hero who watched over it with dedication and pride. And in his heart, he knew that he had found a family in the people he protected, a purpose in the loyalty he gave, and a friendship that would last a lifetime.
Don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel so we can keep bringing you the best stories.